I learned to be grateful when the pain stopped, until the Mafia boss asked why I was shaking. Thalassa's hand didn't tremble as she adjusted the pressurized seal on the billionaire's private aquarium, but her ears caught the rhythmic, metallic clicking echoing through the filtration pipes. It wasn't the sound of a failing pump. It was a sequenced sonar ping used to trigger the scuttling charges on the vault beneath the floorboards. She leaned toward the man standing by the glass and whispered the exact depth charge signature, currently arming itself in the harbor outside. Gunnar Voss, a man who traded in the secrets of the abyss, realized in that heartbeat that his fortified glass palace was about to become a watery tomb. The quiet woman cleaning his tanks wasn't just staff. She was the ghost who had designed the very sonar-triggered explosives currently counting down to his execution. In the freezing, blue-tinted luxury of an Oslo fjord estate, Thalassa Vane works as a high-end aquarist to bury her past as a sabotaged deep-sea engineer. Gunnar Voss is a maritime warlord who believes he controls the North Sea until a rival cartel uses the estate's own geothermal heating system to turn the mansion into a pressurized death trap. When the exit seal and the water begins to rise, Thalassa must decide if she will let the man who ruined her career drown, or use her knowledge of hydro-acoustics to fight an invisible war beneath the waves. The silence of the Voss estate was not peaceful, it was artificial. Perched on a jagged cliff overlooking the charcoal-colored waters of the Oslo fjord, the mansion was a masterpiece of reinforced glass and cold, polished basalt. Inside, the only sound was the rhythmic, low-frequency hum of the life support systems for the world's most expensive private aquarium, a 3-story cylinder of seawater that acted as the home's central pillar. Thalassa Vane moved along the upper catwalk of the tank, her silhouette blurred by the shimmering blue light. To the guards patrolling the corridors with submachine guns tucked under their charcoal coats, she was just the help. A disgraced diver who spent her days scrubbing algae and checking pH levels. They didn't notice the way her head tilted every few seconds, her ears tuned to a frequency they couldn't hear. Deep in the filtration pipes, something was clicking. Tap, 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 tap. It was a rhythmic metallic sequence, a hydroacoustic handshake. "The salinity is drifting, Mr. Voss," Thalassa said, her voice steady and calm as she stepped off the catwalk. Gunnar Voss stood at the base of the tank, staring into the swirling kelp. He was a man who looked like he had been forged in the sunless depths of the North Sea, broad-shouldered, with eyes the color of a winter gale. On the table beside him sat a heavy, waterproof ledger, the biometric lock glowing with a faint, rhythmic pulse of green. "I don't pay you for casual observations, Vane," Gunnar growled, his voice a low vibration that seemed to rumble in the floorboards. "Fix the sensors and stay out of my sight. I have a shipment of liquid assets arriving at the docks in 20 minutes. Thalassa didn't retreat. She walked closer, the scent of sea salt and ozone clinging to her uniform. She leaned down, pretending to inspect the glass, but her eyes were fixed on the reflection of the security team standing by the door. "Don't touch the ledger, Gunnar," she whispered, her voice a soft, sharp thread of warning. Gunnar's hand froze inches from the biometric scanner. He turned his head slowly, his gaze cutting into her like an industrial diamond. "You're overstepping. If you're looking for a reason to be thrown into the fjord, you've found it." "The clicking in the pipes isn't a mechanical failure," Thalassa continued, her voice dropping into a register of cold, technical authority. "It's a 22K HZ ultrasonic trigger. Someone has introduced a cavitation bubble charge into your primary intake valve. The moment you scan your thumb, the pressure spike won't just lock the ledger. It will turn this entire room into a fragmenting grenade." Gunnar's posture shifted instantly. The arrogant warlord vanished, replaced by a cornered predator. He looked at the biometric light, then at the woman he had treated like a ghost for 6 months. "How do you know that specific signature?" he hissed, his hand slowly retracting from the table. "Because I recognize the frequency," Thalassa replied, her eyes reflecting the cold blue of the water. "It's the Kraken sequence. I know it because I'm the one who wrote the acoustic trigger for the very sabotage protocol that's currently counting down in your basement." Before Gunnar could respond, the low hum of the house was replaced by a sickening, electronic screech. The lights in the aquarium flickered and died, plunging the room into a deep, aqueous darkness. Then came the sound, a heavy, metallic asterisk clack asterisk echoing from the depths of the house. "The signal just went wide," Thalassa said into the dark, her hand finding the sleeve of Gunnar's coat. "In 5 seconds, the geothermal locks on the front doors are going to magnetically seal. They aren't trying to rob you anymore, Gunnar. They're trying to sink you." The massive glass panes of the aquarium let out a low, agonizing groan as the pressure inside began to fluctuate. Outside, the fjord was silent, but inside the Voss estate, the air began to shimmer with a dry, artificial heat. "They'll have night vision," Gunnar hissed, his breathing jagged as he clutched the waterproof ledger to his chest. "We're blind." "They have digital night vision," Thalassa corrected, her mind already mapping the structural weaknesses of the room. "It relies on a clean infrared spectrum. We're going to give them a ghost." She dragged him toward the maintenance ladder leading to the secondary filtration deck. But as they reached the first rung, a massive, dull thud shook the foundation of the house. It wasn't an explosion from the outside. Thalassa looked at the floorboards. Water was beginning to seep through the basalt tiles, glowing with a faint, bioluminescent green. "They've bypassed the scuttling charges," Thalassa whispered, her face pale in the emergency light. "They're not just blowing the vault. They've reversed the geothermal pumps. They're filling the house with seawater, and the pressure is already high enough to crush a submarine." As the water reached their ankles, the front gates of the estate were not blown open. Instead, the entire glass wall facing the fjord began to crack, the spiderweb fractures glowing with the weight of the ocean pressing against them. "We have to climb," Thalassa commanded, but as she looked up, she saw the red laser dots of 3 tactical scopes dancing across the ceiling. The hunters weren't waiting for the water to rise. They were already inside, rappelling down through the darkened vents. The water was no longer seeping. It was surging. Cold, North Sea brine poured through the floor vents, swirling around the base of the massive aquarium like a rising tide. The red laser dots of the tactical scopes danced across the basalt walls, searching for heat signatures in the artificial fog created by the temperature drop. Gunnar Voss crouched behind a structural pillar, his knuckles white as he gripped the waterproof ledger. His chest heaved, the sound of his breathing ragged in the pressurized silence of the room. He looked at Thalassa, who was kneeling by the maintenance hatch, her fingers flying across a recessed keypad she shouldn't have known existed. "They're using Wraith sonar," Thalassa whispered, her voice a low, rhythmic rasp that cut through the sound of rushing water. "It maps the displacement of air. If you move too fast, you might as well be waving a flare in their faces." "I have 12 men in this house," Gunnar hissed, peering into the gloom. "Why haven't they responded? Why is my security feed dead?" Thalassa didn't look up from the keypad. "Because your security feed was built on a Vulture backbone, Gunnar. I recognize the handshake in the pipes. They didn't just breach your doors. They've hijacked your entire nervous system. Your men are currently locked in the barracks, watching a loop of an empty hallway while the real world drowns around them." Gunnar stepped closer, the water now reaching his knees. The bioluminescent green glow of the flooding brine cast skeletal shadows across his face. "You keep talking about these protocols. Vulture, Kraken, you're a fish feeder, Vane, a diver who lost her nerve. How do you know the internal architecture of a sovereignty black site?" The keypad let out a soft, electronic chime. The maintenance hatch hissed open, revealing a cramped vertical shaft filled with humming fiber-optic cables. Thalassa finally looked at him, her eyes reflecting a cold, binary light that made the warlord flinch. "I didn't just study these systems, Gunnar," she said, her voice dropping into a clinical, terrifyingly calm register. "I'm the one who wrote the acoustic Vulture encryption for the sovereignty 6 years ago. I'm the reason your impenetrable vault exists, and I'm the reason the people outside know exactly where the fracture points are." Gunnar's jaw tightened. You're the ghost of the grid. The engineer they said was vaporized in the Bergen shipyard explosion." "I was," Thalassa replied, shoving him toward the shaft. "But the people coming through those vents are about to find out that static is a very painful way to die. Now climb. They scrambled into the narrow shaft just as the first tactical team touched down on the gallery floor. From the darkness of the vertical crawlspace, Gunnar watched through a small ventilation grate. 3 figures materialized in the blue mist below, their tactical suits shimmering with active camouflage that bent the light. They moved with a predatory, silent efficiency, their rifles sweeping the room. "They're wearing displacement suits," Gunnar whispered, his hand going to the pistol at his hip. "I can't even see their faces." "Don't," Thalassa commanded, grabbing his wrist. "Light is just a frequency, Gunnar, and every frequency has a fracture point. We aren't going to shoot them. We're going to visualize them." She reached for a heavy copper grounding wire running along the side of the shaft and ripped it free. She jammed the frayed end into the central hub of the aquarium's auxiliary power relay. "What are you doing?" Gunnar demanded. "Visualizing the invisible," she replied. She didn't trigger an alarm. Instead, she dialed the frequency of the aquarium's massive sub-bass speakers, used to mimic the deep ocean thrum for the sharks, to a 19 Hz infrasonic pulse. It wasn't a sound the ear could hear. It was a vibration that lived in the marrow of the bone. Below them, the rising water began to ripple in intricate, geometric patterns. Suddenly, the patterns shattered in 3 distinct spots. The empty air near the center of the room began to flicker violently. The infrasonic waves were vibrating the active camouflage plates on the tactical suits faster than the processors could compensate. The intruders staggered, their high-end visors overloading with white noise as the suits short-circuited. For a heartbeat, they were visible, men in black and gray digital camo, clutching their heads in agony. "Now," Thalassa hissed, "the geothermal override is in the sublevel. If we can reach the pumps, we can reverse the pressure and blow the seals from the inside out." "And if we can't?" Gunnar asked, looking down at the water that was now only a few feet from the ventilation grate. "Then this mansion becomes a pressurized can," Thalassa said, her eyes fixed on the flickering red lights of the server rack. "And we're the ones inside it." A sudden, violent jolt rocked the shaft. A sinister, high-pitched whine began to vibrate through the walls, not a sound of failing machinery, but a targeted acoustic beam aimed directly at the house from the fjord. "They're not waiting for the flood," Thalassa realized, her voice tight with a familiar, tactical urgency. "They're using a localized sonar emitter to resonate the glass. They're going to shatter the entire aquarium pillar." As if on cue, a spiderweb crack appeared on the massive glass cylinder right next to their shaft. A single, high-pitched ping echoed through the metal. "Gunnar, get down," Thalassa screamed. The 3-story tank didn't just break, it exploded. 10,000 gallons of seawater and shattered glass slammed into the room, and the force of the vacuum began to pull the air, and Thalassa straight into the path of the rushing debris. The world dissolved into a freezing, violent roar. When the 3-story aquarium shattered, it didn't just break. It detonated with the force of a tidal wave confined within 4 walls. The pressure differential between the vertical maintenance shaft and the gallery floor acted like a vacuum, pulling the air, and Thalassa straight toward the jagged maw of the vent. "Thalassa!" Gunnar's roar was nearly drowned out by the thundering cascade of 10,000 gallons of seawater. He lunged, his fingers catching the hem of her tactical vest just as her boots left the metal grating. For a heart-stopping second, they hung there. Thalassa suspended over a whirlpool of broken glass and swirling kelp, and Gunnar anchored to a fiber-optic rack, his muscles screaming under the strain. With a primal grunt, he hauled her back into the narrow confines of the shaft, slamming the heavy steel grate shut just as the water line surged past them. They were trapped. The shaft was a vertical coffin, and the water was rising with terrifying speed. "The observation deck," Thalassa gasped, coughing up brine as she scrambled upward. "It's reinforced acrylic, separate from the main house's structural glass. If we can reach the sub-level seal, we can lock ourselves in." "And then what?" Gunnar pressed his back against the vibrating metal wall, the waterproof ledger tucked firmly under his arm. "We sit in a glass bubble and watch them pick the locks on the vault." "No," Thalassa said, her eyes snapping to the fiber optic cables lining the shaft. Her fear had crystallized into that cold, binary focus Gunnar was beginning to find more terrifying than the assassins outside. We use the pressure. The sovereignty built this place to be a fortress, but every fortress has a scuttle protocol. If I can reach the central terminal, I can trick the geothermal pumps into thinking the house has already been lost. It will trigger an emergency atmospheric purge. They reached the observation deck, a circular room submerged beneath the estate's private dock, offering a panoramic view of the dark, silt-heavy fjord. The heavy circular door hissed shut, the magnetic seals engaging with a final, echoing thud. Outside the thick acrylic, the water was a murky, bruised purple, lit only by the flickering emergency lights of the mansion above. But as the room sealed, a new sound began, a high-pitched, rhythmic hiss. Gunnar grabbed his throat, his eyes widening. The air, it's getting thick. Thalassa checked a small, recessed gauge on the wall. Her face went pale. They've hijacked the oxygen scrubbers. They aren't just flooding the house, they're spiking the partial pressure of nitrogen. They're turning this room into a saturation chamber. Speak English, Vane, Gunnar wheezed, his movements becoming sluggish. They're trying to give us the bends without us ever leaving the surface, she said, her hands flying across the terminal. If the pressure keeps rising, our lungs will collapse. If we try to open that door now, the decompression sickness will kill us before we hit the stairs. Gunnar slumped against the reinforced glass, his gaze drifting to the dark water outside. For the first time, the liquidator of the North Sea looked small. You were a saturation diver, he murmured, his voice slurring. They said you lost your nerve after the Bergen job, that you were afraid of the deep. Thalassa didn't look at him. She was rerouting power from the deck's decorative floor lights into the terminal's manual override. I wasn't afraid of the deep, Gunnar. I was afraid of the people who owned it. The Bergen accident wasn't a leak. It was a test of the Vulture protocol. They wanted to see if they could collapse a platform's structural integrity using nothing but sound. I was the only one who realized the frequency was coming from the inside. And you ran, Gunnar said, his eyes closing. I hid, she corrected. There's a difference. Suddenly, the dark water outside the observation deck was illuminated by a series of powerful, rhythmic flashes. It wasn't lightning. It was the synchronized strobes of underwater propulsion units. 3 divers in sleek, black rebreather gear materialized in the gloom, hovering just inches from the acrylic. They didn't carry spear guns or explosives. They carried a single, long metallic cylinder with a glass window. Inside the cylinder, a small, black and silver device pulsed with a rhythmic green light. A tablet on the observation terminal flickered to life, slaved to an external signal. A graining video feed appeared. A young woman with a hearing aid, sitting in a quiet library in Oslo, reaching for a book. The signal is bridged. A voice distorted by a modulator croaked through the deck's intercom. Choose, ghost, the ledger in your hand or the cochlear implant in your sister's ear. One command and the frequency will shatter her skull. Thalassa froze, her hand hovering over the purge command. She looked at the screen, then at the divers outside who were slowly turning the dial on the metallic cylinder. They don't want the house, Thalassa whispered, her voice trembling with a raw, jagged agony. They want the frequency to my sister's brain. Outside the glass, one of the divers tapped a countdown timer against the acrylic. 00:59. The air inside the observation deck had become a thick, sweltering soup, heavy with the metallic tang of ionizing oxygen. Gunnar Voss was no longer the defiant titan of the North Sea. He was slumped against the reinforced acrylic, his face slick with sweat, and his breathing coming in shallow, jagged wheezes. The pressure gauge on the wall was climbing into the red, a silent herald of the nitrogen narcosis beginning to cloud his mind. Thalassa knelt beside him, her fingers pressing into the pulse point of his neck. Her own head felt like it was being squeezed in a hydraulic vise, a high-pitched whine drilling into her teeth, but she couldn't afford to succumb. She had spent years in windowless rooms in the service of the sovereignty, mapping the very frequencies that were now trying to cook them alive. Gunnar, look at me, she commanded, her voice a hollow rasp that cut through the low-frequency thrum of the external sonar. He opened his eyes, but they were unfocused, reflecting the dim, red emergency lights of the equipment rack. "The ledger," he muttered, his hand clutching the steel case with a white-knuckled grip. "The thermal fail-safes. If it hits 60 degrees, the internal thermite ignites. It becomes an oven." Thalassa glanced at the case. It was a cold, hard wedge between them, a relic of a digital empire that was currently being reduced to a thermal signature. "We have less than 3 minutes before your blood starts to boil," she said, her eyes darting around the cramped, glass-walled sanctuary. She didn't look for a way out. She looked for a way to hide from the waves. Her gaze landed on a large copper mixing bowl and a roll of heavy-duty aluminum foil used for the lounge's hookah service. "We need a Faraday cage," she hissed, hauling Gunnar's dead weight toward the booth's reinforced equipment rack. "Copper and aluminum. We have to create a conductive shell that can redirect the energy around us instead of through us." With the practiced, mechanical speed of a signals intelligence specialist, she began wrapping the foil around the rack's frame, creating a jagged, metallic cocoon. She slammed the copper bowl over the ventilation intake, sealing the last gap in their improvised armor. "Get in, now!" She shoved Gunnar into the suffocating, silver darkness of the rack, just as a glass bottle of expensive aquavit on the bar exploded from the internal pressure. As they huddled together in the stifling heat of the rack, the world outside transformed into a low, rhythmic thumping, the sound of the building's structural steel groaning under the thermal stress of the microwave emitter. "Thalassa," Gunnar whispered, his breath hot against her ear. "The Vulture protocol. Why did you build a weapon that can't be turned off?" Her face was inches from his. The guilt she had buried under layers of her waitress persona was beginning to boil over, more oppressive than the rising temperature. "I didn't build it to be pulled, Gunnar," she whispered. "I was told it was for counterterrorism. By the time I saw the Syndicate using my logic bombs for human trafficking, the code was already in the wild. I tried to burn it. I tried to erase myself." "But you can't kill a ghost," Gunnar rasped, a jagged edge of betrayal in his voice as he realized the woman saving him was the architect of his industry's destruction. Suddenly, a violent jolt rocked the estate. The heavy industrial cooling fans on the roof had ground to a halt, and the sound of metal snapping echoed through the floor. A reinforced tablet attached to the rack's interior flickered to life, slaved to an external signal that even her shield couldn't block. On the screen, a grainy video feed appeared. A young woman with a hearing aid, Thalassa's sister, sitting in a quiet Oslo library, reaching for a book. "Choose quickly, Ghost," a modulator-distorted voice crackled through the speakers. "The grid or your sister's heartbeat." Thalassa's breath hitched. Her father had taught her how to build her first radio, but her sister was the only family she had left. The voice explained that the hearing aid was a marvel of engineering, with a remote diagnostic port they now controlled. "They're using a localized GSM burst to bridge the gap to her device," Thalassa muttered, her fingers trembling as she reached for the tablet. "I'm in a dead zone of my own making. The only signal getting out is the one they allow." "If you give them the ledger, they get the master key," Gunnar wheezed, gripping the handle of the case. "They can turn off the power to every hospital, every emergency relay. Thousands will die." "She is my sister," Thalassa screamed, her voice cracking with agony. "I won't let her be another casualty of my mistakes." "And what happens when they have the key?" Gunnar countered. "Do you think they let witnesses walk? You're trading 1 billion lives for one." The countdown timer on the screen hit 00:03. Thalassa's finger hovered over the commit key. If she pressed it, she would send a surge to jam the receiver and save her sister, but the feedback would permanently broadcast the Vulture master key to every pirate server on the planet. She looked at the screen, her eyes blurring with tears. Her finger descended. But the video feed didn't just flicker. It vanished, replaced by a single, pulsing green dot on a black map. "The signal," Thalassa gasped. "It's not coming from the library anymore." She looked up through the gaps in their copper shield. The green dot was moving. The mercenaries hadn't been waiting for her choice. They were using her sister's device as a biological antenna to finalize their own physical link to the grid. "They're using her as a relay," Thalassa whispered, her voice trembling with terrifying clarity. "If they hit the relay through a biological bridge, the feedback loop will look like a system error. The entire city will go dark, and no one will even know we're under attack." As the heat inside the rack became a pressurized chamber of ozone and dying dreams, a shadow moved across the observation deck glass. It wasn't a fish. It was a diver, and they were planting a breaching charge directly onto the acrylic. The pressure in the observation deck was no longer a theoretical threat. It was a physical weight, pressing against Thalassa's eardrums and making every breath feel like she was inhaling hot mercury. The red emergency lights flickered, casting rhythmic, bloody shadows over the bronze and glass remains of Gunnar's sanctuary. Outside the thick acrylic, the diver began to prime the breaching charge, a disk of high-velocity thermite that would turn the reinforced window into 1,000 shards of lethal shrapnel. "The seal is going to blow," Gunnar yelled, his voice sounding thin and distorted in the pressurized air. He fumbled with his pistol, but his fingers were clumsy, his motor skills eroding under the onset of nitrogen narcosis. "Get behind the rack. If that glass breaks, the vacuum will pull us into the fjord before we can even scream." But Thalassa wasn't looking at the diver. Her eyes were fixed on the kitchen's service monitor, which was still flickering with a grainy black-and-white feed from the sublevel scullery. In the corner of the screen, a young man was trapped behind a collapsed steam pipe. It was Nils, the 19-year-old kitchen hand who had shared his sandwiches with Thalassa during her long night shifts cleaning the tanks. He was pinned, the rising water already touching his chin, his eyes wide with a silent, parochial terror. "Gunnar, look," Thalassa whispered, pointing to the screen. "We have to override the kitchen bulkheads. If we trigger the atmospheric purge now to save ourselves, the vacuum will rip the oxygen right out of that room. He'll suffocate in seconds." Gunnar glanced at the screen, then back at the diver outside who was just seconds away from completing the circuit. "It's a kitchen boy, Vane. One life against the security of the North Sea. If we don't blow the external seals now, the divers get in, they get the ledger, and your sister dies anyway. It's the rule of the abyss. You sacrifice the limb to save the hull. Move." "He's not a limb, he's a person," Thalassa snapped. She lunged for the terminal, her fingers flying across the keypad, but Gunnar's hand clamped onto her wrist like a manacle. "This is the sovereignty's world," he hissed, his face inches from hers, sweat dripping from his chin. "We don't play hero, we play for the win. If you break the protocol to save a servant, you're signing our death warrants. The hunters are at the door." "Then let them come," Thalassa said, her voice dropping into that terrifyingly calm, binary register. "I spent my life writing codes that treated people like variables. I won't do it again. Not for you and not for the sovereignty." With a violent wrench, she twisted her arm free and slammed her palm onto the manual override. She wasn't just opening a door, she was hacking the mansion's very soul. She diverted the emergency pressure vent away from the observation deck and into the kitchen's ventilation shaft. It was a tactical nightmare. It meant the pressure in their room wouldn't drop, and it would give the divers a clear path to their position, but it would create a pocket of air for Nils. "What have you done?" Gunnar groaned, slumped against the rack as the high-pitched whine of the breaching charge reached a crescendo. "I gave him a chance," Thalassa replied. On the monitor, the kitchen door hissed open. Nils, gasping for air, scrambled upward toward the attic vents, disappearing just as the water reclaimed the room. But the cost of mercy was instantaneous. By diverting the purge, Thalassa had signaled their exact location to the mansion's internal sensors. The Vulture protocol, sensing a manual breach, began its secondary phase, the erasure. The lights in the observation deck didn't just flicker, they turned a blinding, ultraviolet white. A digital voice, devoid of emotion, echoed through the speakers. "Manual breach detected. Initiating structural dissolution. Total collapse in 60 seconds. Outside the glass, the diver paused. He looked at his wrist-mounted computer, then back at Thalassa. He didn't fire the charge. Instead, he began to swim backward, away from the glass, as if he were fleeing a predator. "Why is he running?" Gunnar panted, squinting through the ultraviolet glare. Thalassa looked at the floorboards. The basalt tiles were beginning to vibrate, humming at a frequency that made the water in the room dance in violent, geometric spikes. "The Vulture protocol isn't just a software erase," Thalassa whispered, her face pale. "It's a resonant frequency attack. It's turning the steel beams of this house into a tuning fork. It's not going to blow the glass. It's going to turn the entire mansion into dust." Gunnar reached for her, but the vibration was so intense that the air itself seemed to shatter. A massive crack appeared in the ceiling, but it wasn't water that came through. It was a cable, shimmering with a strange, pulsing blue light, snaking down from the vents above. "The bridge," Thalassa gasped. "They've linked the house to my sister's implant. The house is the transmitter, and she's the receiver. If the house vibrates to pieces, the signal will fry her brain before the first wall falls." The room let out a groan of dying metal. The floor began to tilt toward the dark, hungry mouth of the fjord. The choice was made, and the price is being extracted in blood and bone. Thalassa saved a life, but she may have just sacrificed the only person who matters. Can she desynchronize the frequency before the sovereign's erasure claims them all, or is the ghost finally out of time? If your heart is pounding as fast as mine, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss the final descent into the abyss. What do you think? Can Thalassa find a way to save her sister without letting the world burn? Drop your theories in the comments. I read every single one, and your predictions might just be the key to the next twist. Thanks for watching. The high-pitched whine of the erasure protocol wasn't just a sound. It was a physical assault. It vibrated through the marrow of Thalassa's teeth and turned the very air into a shimmer of kinetic heat. The floor of the observation deck groaned as the structural steel began to microscopically fracture, resonant frequencies turning the mansion into a self-destructing tuning fork. "We have to get out of the shell," Thalassa shouted, her voice nearly lost in the metallic scream of the building. She grabbed Gunnar's arm, hauling him toward the heavy circular hatch. The pressure had stabilized just enough for the manual release to engage, but as the door hissed open, they weren't met with the cold brine of the flood. They were met with a wall of shimmering, distorted air. Outside the glass, the dark waters of the fjord were no longer still. They were boiling. Large, rhythmic bubbles surged upward, and a dull orange glow began to throb from the depths. "What is that?" Gunnar gasped, shielding his eyes. "Did they hit the geothermal lines?" "No," Thalassa whispered, her horror deepening. "It's a phased array sonar emitter. They've lowered a naval-grade heater rig into the fjord. They're using high-frequency sound to agitate the water molecules around the house. They aren't just trying to shake the house apart from the inside. They're cooking the water to create a thermal cage. If we swim out now, the temperature differential will go into our lungs like liquid lead." A shadow loomed over the observation deck skylight. A massive, black-hulled barge was positioned directly above them, its silhouette cutting off the moonlight. On its deck, a man stood by the railing, silhouetted by the harsh glare of a spotlight. It was Boss Soren, the leader of the Northern Tide, a man who had spent a decade trying to find the ghost who wrote the sovereignty's encryption. His voice boomed through a localized long-range acoustic device, LRAD, the sound waves hitting the glass with the force of a physical blow. "Ghost, I know you can hear me through the resonance." Soren's voice was distorted, amplified into a godlike thunder. "You cost me 3 billion in Bergen when you vanished. You stole the Vulture master key and hid it in the one place I couldn't reach, your own sister's mind." Thalassa slumped against the vibrating wall, her face pale. "He knows," she breathed. "He doesn't want the ledger, he wants the biological bridge." "Release the external cooling vents, Thalassa," Soren commanded. "Release the digital ledger to the barge's receiver, and I will turn off the heater rig. I will let your sister live in her quiet little world. Refuse, and I will increase the frequency until the implant in her ear becomes a molten slug." Gunnar looked at Thalassa, his gaze hard. He was a man who lived by the blade and the bribe, but even he looked sickened. He's using a civilian as a signal booster. If you give him that ledger, every shipping lane in the Atlantic becomes his personal hunting ground. He'll have the power to sink any vessel anywhere with a single keystroke. I can't let him hurt her, Gunnar, Thalassa sobbed, her hands hovering over the terminal. The resonance, look at the feedback loop. On the terminal, a spectral graph showed the house's vibration syncing perfectly with the pulse coming from her sister's location in the city. The house was acting as a massive parabolic dish, and the erasure protocol was the power source. Soren wasn't just threatening her sister. He was using the house's destruction to amplify the signal that would eventually kill her. There's another way, Gunnar said suddenly. He grabbed her shoulder, his eyes burning with a desperate, dark intelligence. You said the house is the transmitter. If we can't stop the resonance, we change the medium. Change the medium? Thalassa asked, her mind racing. The aquarium, Gunnar pointed to the shattered remains of the central pillar. A few inches of water still sat in the reservoir, connected to the primary geothermal pipes that ran deep into the bedrock of the fjord. Those pipes don't just carry heat, they're lined with heavy water coolant. If we can flood the structural core with the coolant, it will change the density of the steel. The resonance won't match the sister's frequency anymore. The erasure will still destroy the house, but the signal to her will flatline. It'll create a massive steam explosion, Thalassa countered. The moment the coolant hits the heated exterior water, the pressure will blow the foundation. We'll be at the center of a volcanic burst. Better to die in a blast than to watch her brain melt on a monitor, Gunnar growled. He handed her his pistol. I'll clear the manual valves in the sublevel. You stay here and keep Soren talking. If he sees the thermal signature of the coolant moving, he'll kill her instantly. You have to mask the flow with a white noise burst. Gunnar, Thalassa started, but he was already moving, disappearing into the dark, vibrating maw of the maintenance tunnel. Thalassa turned back to the terminal. Her fingers were a blur as she began to bypass the audio-out protocols. She didn't send the ledger. Instead, she began to broadcast the sound of her own heartbeat, amplified and distorted, into Soren's receiver. I'm sending the first layer of the key, Soren, she screamed into the mic, her voice cracking. Just wait, the handshake is slow because of the heat. Outside, the water turned a violent, bubbling white. The heater rig was reaching its peak. On her screen, the green dot representing her sister began to flicker. The temperature at the library was rising. Suddenly, the floor beneath Thalassa's feet lurched violently. A sound like 1,000 freight trains echoed from the basement, a deep, guttural roar of steam meeting steel. The terminal screen turned a bright, searing red. Warning, core temperature imbalance, critical steam flash imminent. Thalassa looked at the monitor for the sublevel. She saw Gunnar. He had reached the valves, but his leg was pinned under a falling support beam. The blue coolant was spraying everywhere, turning the room into a freezing, high-pressure fog. He wasn't moving. And on the horizon of the fjord, the black barge began to tilt. Soren wasn't waiting anymore. He had realized the key was a fake. Goodbye, ghost, Soren's voice whispered through the glass, no longer a roar but a cold, final promise. The heater rig didn't just pulse, it stayed on. A blinding flash of light erupted from the water's surface, and the observation deck glass began to turn a molten, opaque white. Then, from the city, a new signal hit the terminal. It wasn't a heartbeat, it was a scream. The scream that tore through the intercom wasn't just a sound, it was a digital laceration. It was the sound of a human nervous system being used as a copper wire. On the terminal, the green dot representing Thalassa's sister, Lyra, began to pulse a jagged, sickly violet. The heater rig in the fjord was projecting a resonance so tight, so focused, that it had turned the mansion into a massive parabolic dish, beaming a lethal frequency straight into the heart of the city. Gunnar, the steam flash, it's not enough. Thalassa screamed into her headset, her voice cracking as she watched the thermal monitors. There was no answer from the sublevel, only the sound of rushing coolant and the groan of shifting steel. Thalassa didn't hesitate. She abandoned the terminal and sprinted toward the back of the observation deck, where a hidden mahogany panel concealed Gunnar's private sanctuary, the Forbidden Library. It wasn't filled with books. It was a graveyard of black market hardware and physical files that the sovereignty had tried to delete from existence. She slammed her palm against the reader. The door hissed open, and the temperature inside dropped 40 degrees. This room was a literal icebox, shielded by 3 feet of lead and copper. In the center of the room, sitting in a bath of liquid nitrogen, was a server that looked like a jagged obsidian monolith. Thalassa, internal thought. I knew he had it. The fallen star drive. It's the original physical ledger of every person the sovereignty ever bought, including the man who sabotaged my father's diving bell. Gunnar didn't just hire me for my brains. He hired me to keep his blackmail safe from the very frequency I created. She lunged for the server, her fingers burning as she touched the frost-covered casing. She needed to find the source code of the Vulture protocol's handshake. If she could find the original seed file, she could invert the phase. Instead of the house amplifying the signal to Lyra, the house could become a black hole for it. But as she pulled the drive, a shadow fell across the doorway. Gunnar Voss stood there, dripping with blue coolant, his face a mask of frostbite and fury. He was leaning heavily on a piece of rebar he was using as a crutch, his leg trailing behind him like dead weight. In his good hand, he held a remote detonator. "Get away from the drive, Thalassa," he wheezed. The frost on his eyelashes made his eyes look like shattered glass. "Gunnar, I can save her," Thalassa cried, clutching the cold drive to her chest. "If I link this to the external array, I can phase-cancel Soren's signal. It'll stop the resonance. And it will broadcast that drive to the entire world," Gunnar countered, his voice a jagged rasp. "Everything is in there. The names of the ministers, the shipping codes, the proof that I was the one who authorized the Bergen accident to cover my own tracks. If you plug that in, I'm a dead man by morning." Thalassa froze. The air in the room felt like it was turning to solid ice. You authorized Bergen. You knew my father was on that rig." Gunnar didn't look away. He was going to whistleblow on the hydro-acoustic weapons program. "I did what the sovereignty required. I did what kept the North Sea stable." He raised the detonator. "I've rigged this room with thermite. One press and the fallen star vanishes. No one learns the truth, and the sovereignty stays in the shadows." "And Lyra," Thalassa's voice was a whisper of pure, cold rage. "You'd let a girl's brain melt to save your own skin." "It's the rule of the abyss, ghost," Gunnar said, a single tear freezing on his cheek. "The many over the few." The house let out a final, cataclysmic groan. The heater rig outside had reached its threshold. The glass in the library began to vibrate so fast it hummed a middle C that shattered the light bulbs. In the city, the violet dot on the monitors turned a blinding, final white. "She's dying, Gunnar," Thalassa shrieked. She didn't reach for a weapon. She reached for the liquid nitrogen intake valve behind the server. "If you blow this room, you blow the coolant lines," she screamed over the roar of the resonance. "The steam flash will level the estate, but the drive will be vaporized. If you want to live, you let me use the signal. You let the world see what you are, or we all burn right here." Gunnar looked at the detonator, then at the woman who was the only person who had ever seen the man beneath the monster. The building tilted. The floor of the library began to slide toward the dark mouth of the fjord. "Decide," Thalassa yelled, her hand on the valve. "Mercy or the abyss." Gunnar's thumb hovered over the red button. His eyes met hers, and for a heartbeat, the warlord vanished. He saw the girl who had cleaned his fish tanks, the genius who had been broken by his own hand. He didn't press the button. He threw the detonator into the liquid nitrogen bath and slumped against the doorframe. "Do it," he whispered. "Burn it all." Thalassa slammed the drive into the uplink. The screens in the room exploded into a kaleidoscope of data, millions of names, dates, and coordinates streaming into the global satellite network. At the same moment, she inverted the phase. The sound in the house didn't just stop. It was sucked out. A sudden, terrifying silence fell over the fjord. Thalassa looked at the monitor. The violet dot had vanished. In its place was a steady, calm blue. Lyra was alive. But the victory was short-lived. A new alarm began to chime, a low, rhythmic pulse. Thalassa looked at the fallen star data stream. Hidden in the metadata of the Bergen files wasn't just Gunnar's signature. There was another name, a name that made Thalassa's blood turn to slush. Project Architect, Vane T. Her father hadn't been the whistleblower. He had been the lead designer, and the frequency that was currently killing Lyra was his final masterpiece. Before she could speak, the library's reinforced ceiling was ripped away. Not by a blast, but by a massive magnetic crane from the barge above. I have the source code, Soren's voice boomed through the open air, and now I have the ghost's bloodline. A harpoon-like tether shot down from the barge, impaling the server rack and dragging it, along with Thalassa, who was still tangled in the cables, upward into the freezing night sky. "Gunnar!" she screamed, dangling over the boiling fjord. Gunnar reached out, his fingers brushing hers for a fraction of a second before the cables snapped him back. He watched as the woman he had finally chosen to save was hauled into the belly of the enemy's ship. But as Thalassa was pulled onto the deck of the barge, she saw something that Soren hadn't noticed. The fallen star drive wasn't just transmitting to the world. It had a second hidden countdown, and it was at 0005. The night air over the Oslo fjord was a freezing whip, lashing against Thalassa's skin as she dangled hundreds of feet above the churning, white-capped water. The magnetic crane of the barge hummed with a predatory power, reeling in the fallen star server like a prize catch from the abyss. Below, the Voss estate looked like a dying ember in the dark, its structural glass glowing with the internal fires of short-circuiting electrical grids. Thalassa internal thought, 5 seconds. The metadata wasn't just a signature, it was a dead man's switch. My father didn't build a weapon for the sovereignty, he built a trap for anyone who tried to steal it, and I'm currently strapped to the trigger. With a violent metallic jolt, the server slammed onto the deck of the barge. Thalassa tumbled beside it, her hands raw from the cables. Before she could breathe, a heavy boot pressed into her shoulder, pinning her to the cold steel. Soren looked down at her, his face illuminated by the flickering green lights of the server's bypass. He wasn't looking at the girl. He was looking at the data. The Project Architect files that proved the ghost's bloodline was the source of all his power. "You have your father's eyes, Vane," Soren sneered, his voice barely audible over the roar of the barge's engines. And his arrogance. He thought he could bury the Vulture protocol in a vault of moral superiority. He didn't realize that in the North Sea, only the sharks survive. "My father," he tried to stop this, Thalassa wheezed, her eyes darting to the server's countdown. 0003. "He failed," Soren replied, kneeling down to rip the master key drive from the chassis. "And now I have the frequency. I don't need the estate. I don't need Gunnar. I have the voice that speaks to every grid in Europe." On the horizon, a sudden, blinding pillar of blue light erupted from the base of the Voss mansion. It wasn't an explosion of fire. It was a steam flash, the geothermal coolant hitting the heated water of the fjord. The shockwave hit the barge like a physical punch, tilting the massive vessel at a 45-degree angle. Soren stumbled, the master key sliding across the wet deck. 0001. The server didn't explode. Instead, every light on the barge, from the navigation strobes to the handheld torches, turned a piercing, ultraviolet purple. The same frequency that had been used to torture Lyra now radiated from the very heart of the ship. It was a digital feedback loop, a logic bomb designed to fry any system that attempted an unauthorized extraction. "What is this?" Soren screamed, clutching his ears as the LRAD speakers on the deck began to emit a bone-shattering screech. "The erasure," Thalassa shouted, scrambling toward the railing. "It's not attacking the city anymore, Soren. It's attacking the source." Below them, in the churning water, a dark shape broke the surface. It wasn't a rescue boat. It was a semi-submersible tactical craft, its hull painted in the matte black of the Sovereignty's internal security force. Through her headset, which was still linked to the mansion's dying mainframe, a voice cracked through the static. It wasn't Gunnar. It was Nils, the kitchen hand. "Miss Vane, the captain. He's alive. We're coming up the port side." Thalassa looked back at the deck. Soren's men were collapsing, their high-end tactical visors short-circuiting and melting against their faces. The purple light was turning the barge into a microwave. She had seconds to move before the fallen star server hit the final stage of its purge, a thermal thermite dump that would melt the barge's hull. "Thalassa, jump." She saw him. Gunnar Voss was standing on the bow of the semi-submersible, his leg heavily bandaged, his face a mask of blood and salt. He looked like a ghost rising from the deep. He held out a handheld acoustic dampener, the only thing that could get her through the purple shroud of the barge's deck. "I can't," Thalassa cried, pointing to the server. "The data, if it goes into the water, the encryption will leak. It'll be everywhere." "Let it burn," Gunnar roared. "The girl is safe, Thalassa. Lyra is clear. Let the world see the truth." But as Thalassa reached for the dampener, a hand clamped onto her ankle. Soren, his skin blistering from the ultraviolet radiation, his eyes bleeding from the resonance, crawled toward her. He wasn't trying to escape. He was trying to pull her back into the fire. "If I drown," Soren hissed, his voice a wet rattle, "the ghost goes with me." He pulled a secondary detonator from his belt, the one linked to the heater rig's emergency scuttle. If he pressed it, the water around the barge would flash boil in an instant, creating a vacuum that would suck both the barge and the rescue craft into the freezing depths of the fjord. Thalassa looked at Gunnar. She looked at the server. "Gunnar, get back," she screamed. "He's going to scuttle the rig." Gunnar didn't move. He stepped onto the railing of the submersible, his eyes fixed on hers. "I don't leave my partner's Vane, not again." Soren's finger moved toward the trigger. At that exact moment, the purple light on the barge turned a brilliant, blinding white. The fallen star server hit zero. A sound like the world cracking in half echoed across the water as the barge's central hold vanished in a pillar of white-hot thermite. The magnetic crane snapped, the heavy steel arm swinging wildly through the air like a giant's flail. Thalassa felt the deck vanish beneath her as the barge began to split in two. She was falling, not into the water, but into the path of the falling crane arm. But as the world turned upside down, she heard a new sound, a rhythmic, high-frequency chirp coming from the water. The submersible didn't just move, it dived. Thalassa hit the water, the cold slamming into her chest like a sledgehammer. Darkness swallowed her. She reached out, her fingers searching for anything in the lightless void. She felt a hand, a strong, scarred hand that pulled her toward a glowing amber portal. But as she was hauled into the dry, pressurized air of the sub, she looked back through the reinforced viewport. The barge was gone, the estate was a ruin. And drifting in the water, caught in the light of the sub's external beams, was a single, waterproof folder. It wasn't the ledger. It was a photo of her father, and on the back, in his own handwriting, was a message she had never seen. "Thalassa, if you're reading this, the frequency has failed. Look for the golden anchor." The sub began to accelerate, leaving the fjord behind. But as Thalassa turned to thank Gunnar, she saw him slumped against the sonar station. He wasn't breathing. And on the radar screen, a dozen new signatures were appearing. Not the sovereignty, not Soren. The signatures were coming from the bottom of the ocean. The interior of the semi-submersible was a cramped, vibrating chamber of red light and the smell of ozone. Outside the reinforced viewports, the Oslo fjord was a churning grave of white foam and sinking debris. Thalassa sat on the cold floor, her lungs burning from the salt water she had inhaled, her fingers trembling as she clutched the waterproof folder she had plucked from the surface. "Gunnar!" she screamed, lunging toward the sonar station. Gunnar Voss was slumped over the controls, his skin a sickly, translucent gray. The exertion of the rescue, combined with the crushing pressure of the erasure resonance, had pushed his body past the breaking point. A dark trail of blood leaked from his ear, staining his collar. "I've got him, Miss Vane!" Nils, the kitchen hand, shouted over the roar of the engines. He was struggling with the manual oxygen flow, his hands shaking. "The pressure!" It hit him too hard. He didn't wait for the decompression cycle. He just dived for you. Thalassa grabbed the emergency medical kit, her movements a blur of desperate precision. She slammed a needle into Gunnar's thigh, injecting a high-dose stimulant, and pressed the oxygen mask to his face. "Breathe, you stubborn fool," she hissed, her tears hitting the mask's plastic. "The abyss doesn't get to have you yet." A ragged, wet gasp rattled through Gunnar's chest. His eyes fluttered open, no longer the hard, flinty eyes of a warlord, but the eyes of a man who had seen the bottom of the world and decided to climb back up. He looked at Thalassa, then at the folder in her lap. "The golden anchor," he wheezed, his voice a mere ghost of a sound. Thalassa opened the folder. Inside was a hand-drawn map of a specific coordinate in the Norwegian trench, a depth no standard vessel could reach. Taped to the map was a physical key, made of a heavy, non-corrosive gold alloy, stamped with a frequency signature, 432 HZ. Thalassa, internal thought, my father didn't just design the weapon, he designed the vault to contain it. The golden anchor isn't a place, it's a physical kill switch for the entire sovereignty network. He knew they would eventually use his mind against his family. He left me the only thing that can shut them down forever. "We're clear of the barge's blast radius," Nils reported, his voice tight with fear. "But the radar, Miss Vane, you need to see this." Thalassa stood and looked at the green sweep of the sonar. A dozen high-speed signatures were rising from the depths of the fjord, moving with a mathematical synchronicity that didn't belong to any navy. "The Sovereignty's silent fleet," Gunnar whispered, his hand reaching out to grip Thalassa's wrist. His touch was cold, but his grip was iron. "They aren't here for Soren. They're here to reclaim the ghost. They'll sink every ship in this harbor to keep you from using that key." Thalassa looked at the folder, then at the man who had authorized the murder of her father, only to save her life twice in one night. The fallen star data was already leaking into the world's servers. The Sovereignty's names were being whispered in every capital city. They were no longer a shadow, they were a target. "The job is done." "Gunnar," Thalassa said, her voice turning into that cold, binary steel. She reached for the submersible's internal incinerator and dropped her old employee contract, the one she had signed as a waitress into the slot. "The nanny is dead. The waitress is gone." She watched as the paper turned to ash. Gunnar let out a weak, jagged laugh. He reached into his vest and pulled out a heavy, biometric remote. It wasn't a weapon, it was the master title to his fleet. He placed it in her hand, his fingers closing her palm around it. "I didn't want a diver, Thalassa," he whispered, his eyes locking onto hers with a terrifying, desperate respect. "I didn't want someone to follow my lead. I wanted the only person capable of replacing me. You aren't my staff. You're the navigator now." The submersible lurched violently as a torpedo ping echoed through the hull. The silent fleet was closing in. "Nils, take us to the trench," Thalassa commanded, stepping into the captain's seat. She didn't look back at the ruin of the estate or the burning barge. She looked at the gold key in her hand. "If the Sovereignty wants their ghost, they can follow me into the dark." Gunnar watched her, a faint, proud smile on his bloodied lips. He had lost his home, his empire, and his health. But as he looked at the woman at the helm, he realized he had finally found the one thing money couldn't buy, a partner who could survive the abyss. Suddenly, the sub's internal speakers crackled. A new frequency began to broadcast, not the Vulture scream, but a soft, rhythmic melody, a lullaby. Thalassa's heart stopped. It was the song her father used to hum. A message appeared on the sonar screen, overriding the tactical data. "Searching for architect, biometric match, Vane L." Thalassa's eyes widened. "Lyra." The frequency wasn't coming from the city. It was coming from the lead vessel of the silent fleet, the one currently locking its weapons on their hull. "The Sovereignty didn't just bridge her implant to the house, Gunnar," Thalassa whispered, her voice trembling with a new, hollow horror. "They've turned her into the pilot of the lead ship. They're using my sister to hunt us." The first torpedo launched, its whitewater trail streaking across the sonar screen directly toward them. "The ocean doesn't forgive. and neither does the sovereignty. Thalassa started this night as a ghost in the machine, but she's ending it as the only heart beating in a world of cold steel. But with her own sister pulling the trigger from the dark, is there any way out of the abyss? If this journey into the deep left you breathless, lean into that like button and subscribe to join our crew for the next descent. Was Gunnar's sacrifice enough, or has the real war only just begun? Drop your theories in the comments. I read every single one. Until the tide turns again. Thanks for watching.